My name is Tyler Smith. I'm a senior environment artist at Probably Monsters, and this is going to be creating interactive illustrations in Unreal Engine 5. So before I go over kind of my process, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. So the early career, I've been in the industry for about a decade now. I got hired back in 2013 at IllFonic back in Denver, Colorado. I worked on a couple early IPs, sort of cut my teeth working on some of these titles, Star Citizen, Friday the 13th. And then in 2017, I got hired to come out to Seattle at Sucker Punch to help work on and ship Ghost of Tsushima. And then afterwards, work on Ghost of Tsushima Legends. So that was a really amazing experience, working with some really amazing, talented people on a AAA title like that. I've also done some illustration and concept pre-production work. So here's some examples of some Magic the Gathering cards I've done. I've also done some book covers, some pre-production and concept work, which is always really fun to do, working on those projects with people. And then in my free time, I love to do my own personal work that I put on ArtStation. So creating landscapes, creature work, and putting that up on my personal portfolio on ArtStation. So what unifies all this is that all these personal pieces that I do, I really love working in Unreal Engine 5. So I discovered Unreal Engine way back in 2014, and when I opened it up, I'm just like, this is really amazing, just the potential of it. Like, I could put on the mindset of like, I can be a model maker, I can be a sculptor, I can be a painter, I can be a cinematographer, I can have a photographer's mindset, I can have a filmmaker's mindset, an animator's mindset. It just goes and goes and goes with all the really cool, amazing creative opportunities that I have. And ultimately, too, kind of what overlays all that is I really felt like a little kid again with all that really fun, exciting, creative sense of just like, hey, I got my Legos out on the carpet, or I got, my Star Wars figures out on the carpet. But, as an adult, making cool, like, creative projects, and getting that stuff to move, things like that. So the inspiration that I had growing up, of course, was video games, movies, things like that. And one other thing that I noticed when I was a little kid was my dad would take us to the Museum of Nature and Science in Denver. If you're ever in Denver, go to the Museum of Nature and Science. The diorama scenes that they have there are really incredible. And I remember as a little, like, 7-year-old being like, hey, this is so amazing. You're in this, like, sterile museum space, and there's this glass box. On the other side of that glass is a whole other, like, world that they've encapsulated and, like, stuck in that, like, frozen time and space. That's so cool that, like, the African savannas on the other side, or like a bayou in Florida, or 500 million years ago, like that whole thing. So I kind of took that passion and applied it to some of the work I do now. But of course, in UE5, you aren't limited to the very static and still element of that, where unfortunately everything's kind of frozen in time, versus everything's like, we can make so many things move. It's interactive art and entertainment, right? So that is the really, really cool element. And of course, while museum dioramas are limited to the beauty of the natural world, we just have, the limits of our creativity. We can do any kind of fantastical, cool sci-fi stuff. So that is a really cool factor that we can work with there. So with that, going into kind of a linear progress through the steps of the process of what I do, this slide that you're seeing right here, this is kind of the chicken scratch note-taking that I do when I start coming up with ideas. So it's kind of the equivalent to my sketchbook, where I'm literally just kind of jotting down, and I kind of have to come back and decrypt because my handwriting is so bad and I jot it down so fast. Like, okay, like if I'm out in a space and it's like, okay, I want to do something, with like with the shore. So it's like, okay, seagulls, surf, spray, like, what I got to hook up something for Niagara for that. Like, I saw this cool Niagara-like thing. How do I transfer that? So just kind of showing what I wanted to see here is that it's not pretty. It's just a lot of very, like, jotting down, and going back and just kind of cleaning it up and optimizing. But this is kind of how the sort of method to my madness. I'm just like, this is how I get this sort of like transcript up. And it's like, all right, this is how I'm going to go about executing it. So getting inspired by your surroundings, I'm very, very lucky to live in what I think is one of the most beautiful places in the world, which is the Pacific Northwest. I live in Seattle. This is a couple of the photos. I am not a photographer. My wife is an amazing photographer, so these are some of the shots that she's taken of some of the adventures that we've been on, and they're just mind-blowingly cool. She really captures the amazing beauty of where we live when we go out there. And so I always think, like everybody has a emotional connection to the places that they've been, and that's always what I try to convey is like, you feel those emotions, you have those stories when you're in that time and place, and that's really what kind of drives like, okay, I want to communicate or connect that to the other people that view the work that I do. So that's what I'm always looking at when I'm kind of taking it in and feeling more of the emotions and also capturing like, okay, what is the vehicle around that I can use to convey what is to get people feeling the way that I was feeling when I was really in that place. And so there's another factor. One other factor that I do is I have a limited amount of time to work on a piece that I do. So I try to keep it at about maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, and I try not to have it stretched into like I have months and months and months to work on a particular piece. And by doing that, I can get in the mindset of being like, okay, I have a limited amount of time to work on this, so then I kind of go into this problem-solving optimization mode, which is like, okay, in order to convey this piece, what's really important in the scene? Another type of art that really conveys this very, very well is plein air landscape painting, where the artists go out in the field and they're like, okay, I have maybe 1 or 2 hours until the lighting changes or the clouds come in or the wind picks up. So I have a very limited window to capture the emotion or the artistic expression that I want to of this place that I'm being. So these are some really beautiful examples by a couple plein air artists of showcasing like, hey, you take the complexity of these trees or this valley or this mountain and you put it down in just like 10 brushstrokes and you get it down to you boil it down to just that really, strong primary sense of what it is you're trying to convey. And so with that, I try to apply that to the same thing that I do when I'm looking at a scene. So for example, in this photo, it's like, okay, I try to isolate where, you have a bunch of different trees in this scene. So it's one species of tree. Most of these trees tend to have, one element to their character. So we boil that down to it's like, okay, it can be one asset. We're going to make one asset that's good from a bunch of different silhouette angles. Maybe we'll have one tree that is going to be part of the focal point that'll get a special kind of treatment on its own. And then looking at the moss species, it's like, okay, technically there's 20 species of moss. And so do we need 20 different species, or am I noticing there's one particular shape in this moss that I'm noticing? I'm going to boil it down to that, where it's just like, okay, there's that one really cool moss shape. I'm going to apply that to all those moss shapes that are going around the water there. Maybe that bit of purple there is like, okay, there's a dead tree, so maybe I'll take that same tree asset and strip all the leaves off and maybe sculpt the branches and the trunk a little bit more, so now you have a dead version of that tree that has a little bit more character to it. Those couple blue dots are like, okay, those are flowers. We can make a flower asset and populate it around the shrubbery there. And then for something very intimidating, like, okay, I want to do this creek or this flowing water, you can then get in the mindset of like, okay, what did I notice about that water when I was there? Was it the bubbling of the foam and the way that the bubbles form around where the water impacts? Was it the clarity and the refraction and seeing those really beautiful different color changes, like the deep rusts and yellows and brown and reds and stuff when I was looking down into the water? Or was it the way that the water was moving around the stones and the foam was, going on that cool like track going down the river and everything like that, or the stream? So that is kind of always in my mindset of just like, okay, now I kind of have this plan set where it's not overwhelming, where it's like, hey, I need to completely encapsulate this entire scene. It's more like, hey, I'm going to capture what's important and what really conveys the emotion. So the second step after I've done all my planning is I building really solid, flexible assets. So I take a lot of time where it's like, okay, you have your one asset, and you really want to make sure that you get that looking good from almost every angle. Like with a rock, it's like instead of making 5 rocks, it's like I really want to take that one rock, and I want to just work on it until it's like you turn that thing in almost any particular angle, and it's going to look good from almost any angle. It's going to get that real mileage, no matter how many times you rotate it, stick it in the ground, put it at any kind of height or angle, and you have that really reliable one particular rock. And this will apply for almost any asset, like a tree or a root set, or any kind of solid shape like that. So this does take time to kind of integrate and focus and polish, and you can always go back and work on your assets again and again. But once you have it in your inventory forever. So it's really nice. I mean, I have a couple rocks that are just kind of my darlings that I just kind of like take out and be like, I just got really lucky with this really great primary shape. I'm just gonna like use it, in my scenes because it's such a great rock. The other thing that I keep in mind is that I unify all my assets to share the same master material workflow. So it'd be like, okay, all of my foliage cards share the same one-to-one texture space. Whether it's trees, bushes, grass, they all share that, just very simple one-to-one texture space, because if I want to change any of those different elements of the actual texture that's going on the foliage card, I know I can just like really quickly swap it for any particular shape that I'd want to do. This also goes, of course, for any wood or trees or twigs or anything like that. I just flatten out all those UVs. I maybe turn them at a bit of an angle so I get a little bit of twist in the tiling wood texture. But just keeping that same mindset of like, okay, these UVs need to follow a certain rule set, so whenever I want to experiment with different shapes, I know that these assets are really good to go. And then as far as how I do my foliage cards, I always want to really keep in mind that these foliage cards are going to look really good, have really good appealing shapes when there's no textures on them. So I keep them in a gray box state where there's no textures or no opacity, and I want to make sure that those overhanging primary shapes of how the leaves bend and how the tree shapes bend and everything like that is looking really, really good, where you could just stick it in just a basic like Lambert gray shader and it would still be an appealing looking shape. You wouldn't have to. And if you have that solid foundation, you can just throw some textures on there and you know it's going on a really solid foundation like that. The third step I do is just building an intriguing space. The other thing I love so much about this art form and real-time art is you get to traverse it. It's not just a flat 2D image that your eyes are moving across. You can take that camera and you can move around in different areas of the space, which is so cool. So I try to brush up a little bit on things like film cinematography and how the cameras move through the scene. I also try to come from a perspective of architecture and golden age illustration. So some of the books by, of course, Andrew Loomis, Illustration, which is one of the best books on that. I still go back to that, even though I got it way back in like 2009 or something like that. Such a great book. And yeah, just looking at classic examples of cinematography, some of the great scenes we remember from Star Wars and stuff like that. And then brushing up on architecture, which I'm doing a little bit more nowadays. It's a really fascinating subject of like when they were designing those cathedrals or those temples or those hotel lobbies, just how people take in the space and then how they traverse through it and how you reveal different things when you move that camera through the space. So when I'm first setting up the primary shapes here, I'm kind of going off of that where very, very simple atmospherics. And then I just make sure those primary shapes are getting that really good sort of graphic design lay-in for that, where it's like, okay, if this is broken down from like a cutout style into 2 or 3 or 4 really good shapes, is that appealing from a graphic design standpoint? So at this stage, and you can take a render of this, take it into Photoshop and like turn on the cutout filter, turn on the paint jobs filter and just be like, would this work as a really good like graphic design book cover or something like that? Is that appealing from that sense? And then you can build your details and actual like realistic rendering on top of that. Frazetta was really, really good at this, where he would take abstract graphic design shapes and then he would build his awesome figures and compositions off of that. So the next thing I do is kind of determining, okay, like what kind of rendering style is it that I want to do? So when I start going about the material that I want to build, I'm like, okay, what particular sort of rendering style, and what kind of way is the planes, how they're going to catch the light, kind of from an illustration perspective. So some of my favorite artists that I like to go through, I really love really opaque, not a lot of specularity or gloss, and really strong sense with a really sharp sense of plane change from going to the top, to the side, to how the different elements are rendered. And so Thomas Sanchez and Sid Mead are 2 of my really favorite artists when it comes to their particular rendering style. I'm not sure what medium Thomas did, but I know Sid Mead was using a lot of, I believe, gouache for his sci-fi pieces, which of course are just mind-blowingly amazing. And so I really emulate that, and it's like, okay, how can I replicate that in the material setup that I'm gonna do? So the first thing when I start to build kind of my mass material pipeline, the first thing I want to do is do the world align blend node. That's just a very simple node where you just plug in, okay, I want all the top faces of my geometry to get a different color than my side and bottom faces do. Or actually the bottom face gets one too, technically, but you don't really see that, so you don't need to worry about it. So what's really great about this, of course, is that you can control, I just set up these very simple material parameters here where you can change up the color. Any normal map that's plugged into the shader, of course, will capture that detail. And what's super, super important, of course, too, as well, is that down on the bottom right there, you can see you can rotate, move, just move these assets however you want in the scene, and those top faces are always going to catch that top color, which is really great. It's a great way to separate, like, okay, everything here, this is the top, this is the bottom, so it helps push that element of really great top lighting without actually having to go into the lighting before you start that part of the process. The next thing I do with the material is I bring up a Fresnel, which is a really great way to help isolate and change outlines of the different assets in my scene. So I just, again, it will capture the normal material or the normal detail in the texture really well, which is really great. And so it's just put into the lerp there and just channeled right into the color. So this is a really great way to help separate different elements and different assets in the scene when they're stacked on top of each other. All you need to do is create another material instance and just change the color for that. And it's a really great way of kind of emulating how the artist did it, where you do a different sort of outline with a different object that's in front of another or behind another. It's a really great way to kind of separate a little bit. And it's another great way to bring some color complexity too. One thing that I really like to do is that I like to do as much of my color work actually in the material itself. I try to keep my diffuse maps or color maps or albedo maps kind of pretty simple. And there's other workflows I do where I kind of do a lot of work in the albedo map, but for this, I really love playing around with the color sliders and just the color picker and getting that set up there. And another one I do, it's just very simple. It's just the two-sided foliage or subsurface scattering. This is, I don't use this as much anymore because Lumen has just been such an amazing tool that's been added, but before Lumen, I was using this quite a bit to help gain a little bit more control of reflected light a little bit without having to do a light bake, because you get that kind of nice little bit of control over faking a little bit of bounce light. And of course, if you have an object that carries a lot of subsurface scattering properties to it, of course you need to plug it in, but I kind of apply this to a lot of my foliage pieces, just regardless, so you can have a nice sense of control with that other side that's in the shadow or past the core shadow of any object that I have in the scene. One thing that I do for my color comps, as far as inspiration, one thing I really love looking at is things like food, candy, packaging. This stuff we see it so much in our regular day-to-day lives that we kind of forget, like, oh my God, these color compositions are amazing. Like, if you just go into a farmer's market, if you go into the produce section, if you go into the candy aisle of like the grocery store, like, these are really cool, appealing, and they've been designed like over decades by, marketing teams and like, where it's like, hey, we want people to view this stuff and make it as appealing as possible, that you want to get it and you want to eat it and enjoy it. And yeah, you can use the exact same thing, just like plug it into the pieces that you do, where it's just like, just make it very candy-like or very, like something you'd really want to take a bite of. That's kind of a weird little analogy that I love using when I do my color comps, trying to keep it in that mindset. So going back to when I start hooking up my textures, so that UV setup that I had before, where it's like, hey, it all shares that same one-to-one space, I just work on making a very simple texture layout. So you can see a couple examples here of different branch textures that I have, and you can see them all sort of like switching through. So I can take one tree asset, and I can just switch through all these different shapes and see what kind of silhouettes I want to have, just based on switching a texture. And it's just simple as just like boom, boom, boom. You can go through all these different primary shapes and just see what kind of benefits to you. For my trees and for my rocks, I keep it really, really simple. I just do your standard kind of tiling. Your tiling textures for bark and wood and stuff like that. I just set up just a basic texture offset or texture tiling. For rocks, I do use a normal map, and then I use a ambient occlusion map and a roughness map. And then I kind of use the previous color setup that you were seeing before to kind of get a bit of that control over the color. I like to keep the albedo a little bit simple on my rocks, just personally. And I do have a color slot too if I just want to add a little bit of like speckle of different values or different colors in there if I need to. Another thing I just discovered that's really, really cool is the floor node. And this is a really great way to, if you want to kind of crunch down and turn some of those more sort of gradient values into something that has a little bit more of a stylish or stylized or banding effect to it. This is a really great way where you take something that is pretty, has a lot of gradient to it, and you can turn it down into like, hey, I have 2 or 3 values, like what you'd see in like a gouache painting or an acrylic painting. And I really like playing around with that. I especially love playing around with this with the water I've been doing recently. It's a really, really cool way to get that like nice, old 2D animation, Studio Ghibli sense of effects like water and smoke and stuff if you kind of take those gradient values out, but you still keep all the detail of the texture. Step 6, this is probably my favorite step, foliage painting. Really absolutely love this. So I just take all those assets that I've made, get them into the engine, and then I kind of go through and just make my sort of palette here of what density do I want, what size variety do I want, what angle do I want it to grab onto the surfaces that I painted on, and of course, like what kind of offset. Do I want some of it sunk into the ground? Do I want some of it floating a little bit more? And it's kind of this really great sort of element of like, hey, I have just enough procedural where it's not overwhelming with the amount of hand-painted work that I need to do. But at the same time, I have complete control over like, hey, I want to nudge some stuff, I want to delete this, I want to repaint this with a different scale. And I just kind of go to town and start working on these different elements of what I have here with the foliage brush. Here's a couple examples here. The one on the left is the paint bucket tool, which I absolutely love. If you want to do something like completely cover a rock with moss, just do the paint bucket tool. You just click on it, and it just like takes every normal angle, depending on the angle that you have. If you set it to 45, it'll just cover the top faces. If you want it to be completely covered like a koosh ball, you just set it to 180, and you just do the one click, and it's done. The foliage brush is also really great too for distant elements, like painting far away trees and stuff like that, like distant trees, distant forests, things like that. And of course, it's not just foliage. On the far right there, you can see things like logs, stones. If you're doing something man-made, of course, like trash, debris, things like that. It's just a really, really fun tool. It makes me feel like when I was kind of painting around with those early Photoshop tools when I was a little kid again, kind of going back to that reference. So this is an example of just like the before and after of the foliage workflow. So this is kind of where most of the laying in of the work that I do when I make a scene is the foliage. That's where a lot of the set dressing comes in, kind of on top of this just kind of very simple piece of terrain with a couple rocks lodged in it and maybe a river lodged in it, and then you can see kind of that on and off element that goes on there. So step 7 is atmosphere. This is another really fun part where you see just how different the night and day like atmospheric perspective is going on here, where you have you kind of struggle a bit to see the element of depth, and then you throw a volumetric fog in there, and it's like, okay, this is in front of this, is in front of this. It's like a height map. It's a really great way to get that element of depth and mood, of course, with what you're seeing there with this particular scene. So the next thing I'll start doing is I like personally using a lot of 2D plane clouds with a cloud material on it. I really love the volumetric clouds that Epic has been making, but I haven't quite pried myself away from the old way of making the clouds just yet, because I really, really love working with the old hand-painted 2D textures and the photo bash textures that I have. And I really love having a lot more control of like having the flow maps and the panner maps like move the clouds through the scene. And I also, of course, love really like hand dressing and placing exactly where I want to place them, where these cloud cards are going to be. So a little bit of breakdown here with the different node chains that you're seeing here. It's just a simple parallax occlusion mapping with a photo bash texture there, and just a couple of parameters to be like, okay, how much depth do we want with that POM map? We have a flow map, and this I found out too recently, this doesn't have to be your classic kind of like red and green like flow map. It can just be a black and white texture that you plug in, and the UV coordinates will warp and change just like you did with an old school flow map that you'd have to create in Maya or Flow Map Painter or anything like that. And then of course, just a simple panning texture with a bit of fade on the sides to get the clouds to kind of pan through, and then have that flow sort of morph it a little bit, and then have the parallax occlusion mapping kind of take it off here. This is an example of placing a cloud in the scene, or a cloud card in the scene, so this mist kind of going off of the water here. And you can see the flow map kind of moving there and the panning texture moving. And this next slide will show a couple different examples of the parameters that I have set up with this master material. So I can, of course, swap the texture. So one texture to another, I can swap from mist on the ground to a more fluffy cloud. I can do stylized clouds if I want to. Different elements of opacity. If I want the really thick fog, I just kind of turn up the power with that opacity mask. I can change up the amount of flow, and I can, of course, change the speed of the panning, whether you want that cloud to move a little bit faster or not. And then, of course, you can take it even further. I really love taking just basic cloud planes, and I love breaking out the deform modifiers, and I can warp and twist them, and the texture, of course, will treat that like a roller coaster track and just go through it in all kinds of really cool ways. So this one is just a very simple kind of donut-like change, but if you place this in the right way, you get these really nice kind of vignette, wisps of clouds going across the scene and everything. And then, of course, if you want to plug this into an effect, like you plug it into Niagara, you can get, that just opens the floodgates. You can get all kinds of really cool effects with that if you take this whole process here and then you plug it into a particle effect, and that's really, really exciting when you do that. So step 8, the lighting. I am so excited to be working with real-time art right now. The days of, okay, I'm gonna bake my lighting, so it's like, all right, I'm gonna click the swarm render button, I'm gonna cross my fingers and just hope I don't get a big menu with a million different red warnings on it because I forgot to do the light UVs in a certain way. Those days are gone, and I am very happy for that. Yeah, this demo just got me so excited with real-time global illumination. We can literally light at the speed at which we are thinking pretty much now, where it's like, okay, I want the lighting to be like this, and it's like you're in the real world as a cinematographer, better than a cinematographer because you don't have to rely on the elements of the real world. So it's like, all right, my lighting is moving at the speed at which I'm thinking creatively, and it's a wonderful time. And with that, it kind of, I think, raises this sense of okay, now as far as inspiration of what we can do, it's not just okay, realistic depiction of a sun and sky. That's great, but we have this entire tool set of using lighting, or this entire inspiration looking at these amazing films of okay, how do we want to use lighting and local color to push the elements of emotion and tell a story? So I'm always looking at these really great color keys and these really great examples that I see in film and stuff of just okay, we got realism down. Now, how do we push this to tell the story and really artistically express what the scene's going to be even more? Because film and animation's been doing it for such a long time, and they just have these amazing examples of how they're using color to convey these different emotions in the storytelling. So a couple different elements that I do with the lighting is first, I'll take a couple props, just very simple blocks, and just put them over the spotlights, or sorry, the foreground of the scene. To help separate a little bit of the foreground, middle ground, and background. So I'll have a couple blockers parented to the camera so that you can see kind of here, it's sort of turning on and off. So you can get that better sense of depth where it's like, okay, you got that nice dark silhouette like you see in so many good illustrations, sort of separating where the spotlight will go to the middle ground and the background, and keep the foreground as that nice sort of framing element. And then I'll throw in a directional light, and then I'll also throw in, I love throwing in spotlights and treating it kind of like stage lighting, where you can just kind of pump up and sort of punch up those little elements of the scene where it's like, okay, I want to take that extra bit of spotlight and just really, hit home that really strong local color that I have on that object in the scene, or I want to really change up and really enhance the temperature change. So I'm gonna, make it a little bit more blue or a little bit more orange or a little bit more purple or yellow, something like that. And then, of course, too, how the lights are interacting with the volumetric fog. I really love playing with that as well because there's different aspects too of hey, these different elements of the atmosphere and how the fog is playing off of that. I really want to work with that as well of how you get those different elements of depth in the scene based off how the lights are interacting with the fog. Some lights I'll just turn all the way off and be like, I don't want any fog on those, and then some I'll be like, all right, I might actually put it down below the scene or under the scene, like concert lighting or something like that, and just really pump up the fog where you'll get that great sort of Killian Ang kind of atmospheric. Step 9, which is just post-process and camera setup. This is pretty straightforward. I still love using LUT textures, or LUT textures, I guess is how you pronounce it. Yeah, really love using these. You just take a render, put it into Photoshop, just put a color correction, vibrance, and levels, and then you just put it over this kind of weird little bar thing here, and just put it back into the post-process volume. And it's essentially like taking your scene and taking it into Photoshop and putting all the power of color correction, vibrance, and levels. And then when you plug it back into the scene there, it just totally works. It's a really cool tool, and that's been around forever, since I don't know when, like 2013 or 2014 is when I found out about it. And then camera setup, I used to just be, kind of like, all right, I'll put the camera there, I'll get the shot, that'll be great, but I'm starting to get more and more where it's like, I'm missing out on the advantage here, or this opportunity here where it's like the camera, the way that it moves through the scene is another artistic expression in itself. You see this in film all the time, like, is the camera down low as an observer? Is it up high as an observer? What's the speed at which it's moving? Are we gonna actually animate the camera and how it like moves through the scene in a certain way to get that little bit of extra like emotion in the scene and how it's conveyed? So I just set that up in a simple sequencer with the camera and a couple different elements of my scene and just let that go. So we get those really great video files for the post on ArtStation. And then the final step I do is whenever I kind of set out to do this scene, I'm like, okay, what extra steps do I want to take to kind of push, where I'm a little bit uncomfortable of just like, hey, what elements would I love to do and where do I want to push myself a little bit more? So one thing, of course, I love to do is water. I could do water pretty much with every piece probably for the rest of my life. It's just such an amazing thing. And so I find out different ways to do it of just like, okay, is it going to be waterfalls? Is it going to be, the ocean? Is it going to be rain? Is it going to be, different types of, rivers and streams and stuff like that, and how they're expressed in different ways with how they interact. I could go on and on, but, water in its many forms, I always go to that just because I love doing it so much. Wind is another one too. So how the wind is interacting with your foliage. That's another great way of just like, okay, how am I going to convey another emotion of just like the movement at which it's interacting, how the wind is interacting with the foliage in the scene. That brings about another emotion. Is it very calm? Is it very distressing? Is it very kind of foreboding or sort of melancholy the way that it's moving or interacting with your objects? And of course, that opens so many opportunities too. Like now it's just trees, grass, and more trees, but it's like, okay, cloth, cables, trash blowing in the wind. Like it's a great way to just get that little bit of cinematic oomph to your scene there. I love working in Niagara, Cascade back in the day and Niagara now. So I love adding these extra elements of life to my scene here. So, and it's really great too, because like every opportunity is just like, at first it's like, okay, I want these birds like flapping around. This one in the top left is like, okay, can I get bees to actually land on a flower and then fly away again? Is that something I could possibly do? And I'll always go back to these a little bit again, because I can always polish them up and be like, all right, that kind of worked, but I feel like it can be a little bit more polished with that. But yeah, just absolutely love working with these little elements of life that I bring to the scene, like the schools of fish or flocks of birds, moths, and it's not just like you see this one element of birds here, and they kind of have that they're flapping and moving around and stuff, but I was actually observing like swifts and how they like move through the scene, and it's this really pretty, like they just kind of do this really quick like flap flap flap, and then they sort of dart like a bullet like through the air. So I kind of wanted to see like, okay, can I capture that? So the top middle right there is kind of more, I'd say a more kind of polished, realistic sense of like, oh, that's actually how birds fly. It's not just this sort of like, up and down. You can add a little bit more character to that. And then one thing I'm doing now, kind of the extra steps for that is I'm starting to dive a little bit into animating some of the creatures in my scene. This can be very intimidating of just like, okay, like I reached out to some of the animators at my job. It's like, hey, I'm thinking of animating a little bit of something for my scene. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, I'm doing a walk cycle for a quadruped. Is that gonna be okay? And they're like, oh dude, that is like the toughest thing that you could possibly do. So it's definitely not perfect, and I did the disclaimer of like, look, I'm not an animator, but I just went frame by frame through the anatomy book of how a horse walks and transfer that to this deer here. So the one kind of way that I can get over the intimidation of like, how on earth am I gonna like rig and animate an entire creature is I think back to like the old animatronics at Disneyland, where obviously those animatronics are very charming, but they didn't have a full range of motion. They had those like one or two animations that really brought the charm of like they did one movement and they did another movement possibly, and that was it. But it was still like an entertaining thing to do. So it's like, okay, if I just get this falcon to like jerk its head a little bit, or I get these ibises here to just kind of do a little bit of wing flap, and I still want to really come to this and be like, okay, there's a lot of polish that can still be done. There's still a lot of movement elements here that need a lot of work, but just adding more and more of that movement to your scene just really brings that immersion and just really kind of makes that special thing. And I really love it because, again, it goes back to like this kind of art form is very much like, hey, it's a moving, interactive, dynamic sort of art form, and really taking advantage of that and moving away from just like, hey, this is a static 2D image. It just happens to be made in UE5 versus like this is a UE5 piece of art, which is that it's something that can't be replicated because it's a 3D space. And that's this really cool way that this medium is really taking off, I think. And with that, that's my process. Thank you very much for your time.